Hi guys, welcome back to. Oh my god! Wait, I have a
Wait,
new
did you
name.
find a name for your podcast?
Bigmouth.
Bigmouth. Oh, that's right. Okay.
Yeah. Wait, should I say welcome back to Bigmouth podcast or?
Welcome to Bigmouth.
Today, Sunil and I will be talking about identity in terms of like your nationality and race.
Thank you for having me, Mamie. I'm excited to be on. I guess this would be like the inaugural episode of Bigmouth.
Was it?
Like the first episode since
Oh,
you
yeah,
decided
yeah.
to name it Bigmouth. Can I just ask you, why did you go with the name Bigmouth?
Cause like, Bigmouth has always been kind of like an insult when someone keeps like spreading their like friends' secrets. But I feel like I could call this podcast Bigmouth because I'm using this as a platform to talk about anything and everything. So
Right. No filters.
yeah.
Keeping it real. Got it. So that's because I'd never heard of the phrase big mouth being used in the way you just described it. So I'm guessing that's another sign of my like rapidly aging self. Anyway, well,
Okay.
I'm excited to be on your podcast today and talk about identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so starting off, recently Sunil and I have been reading a book called Crying in H Mart, and it's written by this half Korean, half white author who's talking about the death of her Korean mom. And in the book, she talks a lot about her experiences as a mixed kid and how she sometimes feels disconnected yet very connected with her Korean side.
So basically, the author Michelle Zauner, she lost her mother to cancer. I think about 6 or 7 years ago at this point, and in the time since, the article is kind of a reflection, sort of a meditation on her relationship with her Korean identity, particularly through sort of the vessel of food, and how it was through her mother and her mother's cooking that she really felt linked to her Korean identity. And then when her mother died, she sort of that she was worried that that aspect of her would sort of die with her mother. And the piece is about sort of her journey to reclaim that through going to H Mart, which is like, I don't know, do you want to explain what H Mart is?
I mean, I've never lived in America, but from what I know, I think H Mart is like an Asian market, like that sells actual authentic stuff. And anyway, so reading this book, I feel like I could relate to a lot of things that Michelle said, because even though I'm not an actual mixed kid, um, but I'm like a Taiwanese kid that grew up in a very Western community. So I can kind of feel and relate to the disconnection with, I guess, my actual like ethnicity, like not feeling Chinese enough or not feeling Asian enough, because I guess I was really whitewashed as a kid.
Mm.
But you're like an actual mixed kid, so.
Well, let me just ask you a question though. Can you like, what's an example of like a moment where you felt super disconnected with your Chinese identity?
I guess I was like kind of thinking about it on the way here. Like, I used to try to convince people that English is my first language, and that like, because I'm actually 1/8 German, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's like a fact. But I
So
used
you're
to,
mixed.
yeah, but I used to like emphasize it a lot to people and try to prove that like I wasn't fully Asian. Like I'm still like kind of white, because at Concordia or like my school, being because in elementary school it was mostly white people,
Mm-hmm.
and so all the Asian kids wanted to be part of the white people, and like I would always when in public I would always try to speak English like really loudly so that local people would think I'm so cool. I didn't know which side of me I wanted to be.
Right. So you felt like you existed at this border,
Yeah.
and depending on like the social situation, you're kind of like a chameleon, right? And you
Yeah.
would maybe change colors to
I felt like an imposter.
right imposters. You probably have a fair amount of imposter syndrome, right?
Yeah.
um, yeah. Did you ever like use the fact that you're 1/8 German as a way of like claiming this like white side of your identity? Did you ever like go around telling people that? Like, by
Yeah,
the way, like my grandmother is actually from, I don't know, like Munich.
yeah, definitely. Like, cause
And you were born in what, Shanghai,
born
right?
here, yeah,
Yeah, you didn't even spend any, like even a year in like Canada or
yeah,
anywhere in the West.
never.
Do you know where it's your grandmother on your dad's side?
The German? No,
Yeah.
it's my great
Oh, your
grandmother
great
actually.
grandmother.
Yeah,
Do you know where in Germany?
Berlin.
Berlin?
Yeah, I've never even been there.
Are you gonna do one of those like find your roots trips where you go visit like where your great grandmother's from and figure out the whole story? Has anybody told you the story of
I
her side of the family?
I actually think that my great grandma, the German one, she like immigrated to China, like Beijing, and that's where
Oh,
she met my great grandpa.
that's really interesting
Yeah.
actually. I feel like there was a lot of that like intermixing um, in China, particularly I would imagine like during that time period. This must have been like the 1920s or 30s or
Yeah.
something around then.
Yeah.
So that was back when there was like all the foreign concessions and yeah, it's just there's a really interesting history of like interracial mixing
Hmm.
during China, particularly in that time period, like the 1920s and the 30s before World War II.
I remember you saying that like um you always looked as a kid, you looked really American. Like you couldn't
Mhm.
really see the Indian side physically, and then your teachers would ask why you have such an Indian name.
Yeah,
Want to elaborate on that?
sure. Um, so, just to provide some more context, as you alluded to, Mamie, so I'm half Indian on my dad's side.
Hmm.
So my first name and my surname are both Indian. And it's actually funny. I asked my parents, I'm like, because both my brother and I have Indian first names, and I asked my parents like why they picked Indian names and not something maybe like a little bit more like
Normal.
anglicized or like
Yeah.
ambiguous. And my mom was kind of just like, yeah, I had no choice in the matter. Like my dad was just like, my kids are having Indian names,
Hmm.
right? Um, so my dad is from India and my mom is from Croatia, but I also have a lot of like I don't know like attributes, physical attributes and characteristics that sort of make me look, I guess, white,
Hmm.
for lack of a more nuanced term. And I actually still remember there was one time when I was I played baseball when I was growing up, and I think baseball in many ways is like the epitome of sort of like an all American sport,
Hmm.
right? It's the national pastime. It's what you think about when you think about sort of like America and freedom and sports. Um, and I was joining a new team, and I introduced myself to my coach. And um, when I said my name, my coach was like, "Wow, like you're actually from India. You look like an all-American kid."
Hmm.
And I was just kind of like, "Well, what does that mean? Like, what are you trying to say when you say I look like an all-American kid, but because I have an Indian name, I'm somehow not. I can't be all-American?"
Hmm.
And I remember that was kind of one of like many examples of I don't think they were like intentional.
Hmm.
I think there was like a fair amount of just ignorance at play because even more context, I grew up in like a very white part of the country in a suburb in Colorado Springs to be specific, which is like a really conservative, pretty white part of the country. And so I just think there was a little bit of a general like ignorance of the fact that like you can't be all American or you can't be American unless you don't unless unless you look like you're American or you have an American sounding name. And so that was one of the like many small things that made it a bit difficult to kind of like navigate my own identity because like on the one hand I was being told, well, you look like an all American kid
Hmm.
or you don't look like you're Indian, but you can't really be American because you've got this really weird sounding name and you've got this your parents are immigrants. And so yeah, that was interesting.
Hmm. I think another part of why I might consider myself like a kind of mixed but not really mixed kid is because my passport is Taiwanese, but I was born and raised in China, and like so I was traveling in Sanya recently, and while in line for one of the activities, one of the workers asked me where I'm from, and I was like, yeah, I'm Taiwanese, and he said, oh, Taiwan Tongbao, and Tongbao basically means like, oh, we're homies from the same country or
Mm,
province. And then I was like, oh shit, really? You're also Taiwanese? And he was like, oh, Taiwanese are Chinese, right? So yeah. And I was just like, oh, okay. Like, I know now a lot of Taiwanese will still get really defensive and try to pull out all the facts and fight for the fact that Taiwan is their own country. And I also used to be like that when I was really young. But recently I've realized that, like, this is an argument that will never end. Like, Chinese will always
right.
believe that Taiwan is a province. Taiwanese will always fight for the fact that they're a country. And I've always been kind of torn, right? Because I've been raised in China, but my passport is Taiwanese, and all my family is there. But then, like, is there really that big of a difference? So, should I consider myself Chinese or Taiwanese?
Yeah, well, I think the interesting thing about that is they're not mutually exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, just as like someone from, like, I maybe, like, correct me if I'm wrong here, but like, this is one way you could view it. Just as someone from like Sichuan views themselves like as very different from someone from Dongbei, or
Mm-hmm.
even maybe a better example would be like the Shanghainese who have like a very distinct language, culture, like culinary history. I think the tricky thing with like the whole Taiwan aspect is like the really kind of the politics that
Yeah,
come
I think
alongside it.
the
So
biggest difference between like my situation and the situations you named is that like if I said, "Oh yeah, I'm Chinese," then other Taiwanese people would be like, "There's clearly a difference. Like
right,
you're Taiwanese or you're Chinese." But then if I said I'm Taiwanese, Chinese people would be like, "Oh yeah, Taiwanese are Chinese."
right. So this is actually sort of the difference between like ethnicity and nationality,
Yeah.
right? And your identity, I don't want to say crisis is a really strong word, but your some of the aspects of like your identity, some of the nuances of your identity that you have to navigate, I think fall in line more with the whole sort of like nationality debate, and like
Yeah.
particularly given sort of the weighty context of like Taiwan and China and
Mhm.
all the politics that are going on surrounding it. Whereas like for me, I think it was a lot more like just ethnicity. Like I think
Yeah.
that you, from an ethnicity standpoint, right? Like you would consider yourself Chinese.
Yeah.
Yeah. You speak the language fluently.
Yes.
Um, Culturally, Taiwan shares more in common with mainland China than it
Yeah.
doesn't. But it's really like that nationality piece, which I think it plays into identity as well,
Mhm.
right? Because there are certain aspects of your identity that are forged along like borders, essentially, like concepts of nationality.
Mhm.
So, do you um, do you ever feel? So I've heard that. Let me ask you this question. I've heard this from some people who are Taiwanese and live here in China, that they almost like people in Taiwan kind of consider you guys like,
大陆人.
maybe you can explain what that is and like what the connotations are, but that also must be when you go back, like
Mhm.
what's that like?
'Cause like something really like one thing you can definitely tell from Taiwanese people is their very apparent Taiwanese accent, right? And
Uh,
after living in China for so long, my Taiwanese accent is basically gone. And when you go back, people can definitely tell. And then they're always like, "Oh, 你是大陆人," which is like you're Chinese.
yeah, I think it's interesting. I think in terms of dislocation related to like identity, yeah, I think you must feel it in like a very different way from me.
Mhm.
Like when I was growing up, um, I think because I actually felt like I had a home like there was no question in my mind that I was like American, right? Because like I was raised in the middle of the country. I think where my identity issues lied more was like when I kind of thought about like where my parents were from
Yeah.
and how I could like could I claim that, right? And so right now, like I'm wearing my Croatia jersey because Croatia's playing in the Euro in the Euro elimination round tonight, round of 16, and I remember when I watched the first opening game between the UK and Croatia, I went to this like bar to watch it, and there was some other like real Croatians there, and there was
Yeah.
this Croatian girl who came up to me and started talking in Croatian. Like I couldn't respond to her. I'm like, oh, I still say it jokingly. I'm like, I'm fake Croatian. Like my mother grew up there, but then she came to the U.S.
Yeah.
And what was really cool actually was like they thought that was kind of cool, and like so there was a group of Croatian people there, and they kind of like accepted me into their group. And I think a big part of it was because like the Croatian fans were like significantly outnumbered by the British fans.
Yeah.
There was like hundreds of British fans at this bar, and there was only like 4 or 5 of us, and they were really really cool about it. But in the past, like when I went to India, I felt like sometimes like so more kind of like important context here. My dad was the first in his generation among like all of his siblings and his cousins to like marry outside of his race. And in India, this is like super controversial. And it was a really, really big deal. And so I was among all of my cousins, my brother and I were the first mixed kids, like in our entire generation. Like in basically, if you think about it, like this entire massive Indian family, and we were the first mixed kids to pop out, right? Now, today, like a bunch of my cousins are in interracial marriages.
Yeah.
But back then, it was like one of those things that definitely like every time I would go to like family weddings in the US that were, you know, my cousins or my second cousins, or when I'd go to India, I felt like, you know, I would get talked about, my brother and I would get talked about almost kind of like we were different. We were like others. We weren't true Indians, right? Like we kind of had a bit tainted aspect. And I don't want to overstate it and say that like we were like super marginalized within our family. Like I still love my Indian family and they're still super great, but we definitely like could sense, or at least I could sense that kind of feeling that that like maybe we weren't real Indians. And still, like when I go to India and I like meet Indians, like people in India, yeah, I definitely kind of get this like, oh, you're kind of a fake Indian, right?
Yeah.
And it's kind of a joke that like I'm a fake Desi, right? Like it's kind of become a joke. I think that's one thing just that I've learned. Like humor can be a really great way of like kind of confronting these issues.
Yeah.
So I just kind of like learned to kind of almost like embrace some of like the tropes or the jokes that were made about my mixed identity and kind of just like make them my own and be like, yeah, like embrace that, like the fake Desi like mentality. And I think what I realized when I kind of like relaxed a bit about it, or when I eased up a bit about it and kind of took some of these like comments or these observations about my identity in stride, and with like a little bit of, with like a tinge of humor to them, it just kind of like made me feel more comfortable. And I think that's what like comedians like Trevor Noah who are mixed, like I think that's what they do a lot too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what's also funny? I feel like something that kids like me might struggle with is that obviously like my English is so much better than my Chinese. And like, but the thing is I'm not Asian American and I'm also not an ABC. Like I'm just Chinese, like through and through. But then like I don't feel Chinese enough.
Yeah.
But then yeah.
Well, I think this is interesting because you've grown up in like an American school environment. In some ways you existed this kind of weird, like you don't have an American passport. So you can't like it'll be, and maybe you don't even want to, but it would be like more challenging for you to work there in the future.
Mm-hmm.
But here in China, maybe you'll still be considered as a little bit of an outsider because like your Chinese might not be so good,
Yeah.
right? That you could like adapt really easily to a very local working environment. Are you worried about that at all? Or do you have like anxiety about how you might fit in as an adult?
Yeah.
Like I think as sorry if I may, like as a
Mm-hmm.
teenager, it's like a bubble.
Yeah.
But like if you move back to Shanghai after you go to college as an adult, it's a lot different. And like some of these like nuanced differences in like, yeah, your ability to like read and write Chinese, right? That stuff might matter. So how do you think of that as you think towards your future?
Like my parents would always force me to practice Chinese because they would be like, "Oh, because you can't stay in America in the future. When you come back, you're gonna need to find a job, and if your Chinese is this trash, like no one's gonna want you." But then like also, I know that's true. Like I am quite worried about that, but I also feel like um, I used to believe that it wasn't as important because English would be my advantage. But then like now, all Chinese people are learning English. And then like what if in the future everyone can speak English? Then I have no advantage. So I feel like it's really important for kids like me who grow up in Western environments to learn like their native language.
Right. Well, that was actually like, it's funny you bring that up. That was one of the things that I like still am mad at my parents about for. And actually, it's funny. Michelle Zauner talks about this in her book that when she was growing up, she used to hate to go to Korean class.
Yeah.
And she totally like rebelled against it. And now, like the biggest regret she has, and the thing she is most angry at her younger self about is being so stubborn when it came to learning Korean. Because as she would learn later on, that was she then missed an opportunity to be able to communicate with that side of her identity. And like local people, like her family then didn't speak English or to be able to travel and navigate Korea. And so similarly, I still remember my mom used to like, she bought all these books in Croatian and she used to like read them to me. And I think kind of tried to like get me to absorb some of the language. I don't think my dad ever made an effort with Hindi. I think that's because like in India, like everybody speaks English anyway. So he's like, he's not going to need that to travel back. But I think my mom did make a little bit of an effort. I still remember what those books looked like. They were like Croatian children books. And I definitely was like not very like cooperative. And I also, but I still, it's funny, I still do like look back and kind of wish that my parents had made like a concerted effort. I wish they would have punished me more for not like being willing to learn it, but made a more concerted effort. I could have been trilingual.
Wait, what's the third language?
English, Hindi, and Croatian. Yeah.
But now you're only English.
Just English. And a little bit of Chinese.
Okay.
Yeah. 1.5 languages. But, so, you know, I think my parents then would always say like, well, the only language that we spoke in common was English. So my parents could only communicate with one another in English. So it was kind of funny, but language is definitely like one of the most, I mean, it's the most obvious tool, right? In terms of how we can connect to like our identity, or aspects of our identity that we may be removed from in some way, whether it's like by distance or circumstance. But like maybe, what about like food? So that's what the primary focus of Michelle Zauner's book is, but I'd be interested for you to hear, because this is a big thing for me, but I'd be interested for you to hear, is there like a distinct like Taiwanese cuisine, and like does that connect you to your Taiwanese culture in any way?
Yeah, there's definitely a difference between Chinese food and Taiwanese food. And whenever I think of like Taiwanese food, I always
Go ahead.
I always think of like the food that I would miss in Shanghai, like the food that my grandma would make whenever I go back. And that's like kind of like
comfort food?
Or comfort food for me.
Yeah.
Like food from home, even though like Shanghai is my home. But then Taiwanese food is like my comfort food.
Right.
And then, but also not just like Chinese and Taiwanese food. When I was young, because we always eat Chinese food or Taiwanese food at home, right? For like regular meals. So like Western food would be a treat. But
Hmm.
then I know a lot of Asian kids who go to America for like college, they feel so like deprived of Asian food. And like I know a lot of my friends who went to boarding school in America for high school are like, "Oh, I miss Chinese food so much." Like after you eat it for like more than a month, American food is like trash. Like I'm sick of this shit.
For me, like with food, um, let's see here, where to start. So my mom, the interesting thing was my mom never really cooked Croatian food. I actually don't even know what that is. And this is like, well, I kind of have a sense of what it is. It's like Mediterranean,
Yeah.
kind of like not really Italian food, but like there's just like a lot of dishes that have like a lot of olive oil and like I don't know, right? See, even from just like how I'm failing to give an articulate description of Croatian food, it shows you how little I know about it. But that was because like my mom cooked like amazing Indian food. It was
Your
super.
mom
My
cooked?
mom,
Oh,
my mom could cook better Indian food than my dad because I think
interesting.
my mom's just like a better cook.
Uh-huh.
And then my dad would like say my mom went to India like back in the day and like learned how to make these dishes and like at home for me like my comfort food was like number one my mom's spaghetti. So that's like Italian
Yeah.
American, but it
Yeah.
was so good. And what I thought was like really interesting was like even how like when my mom would make American dishes, she would infuse I think elements of like her own background from Croatia and Indian flavors into them. So like when my mom made spaghetti, like you know like a traditional like spaghetti bolognese, right?
Bolognese.
You don't say bolognese.
Spaghetti bolognese.
Is that how you say it?
Yeah, anyway, yeah.
Yeah, you need to learn English. Is what you. No. Okay, bolognese. Like my mom would make it to match the palate of like my dad, and then also just like what we'd grown up eating. So like it would be like a more like a curry, not like a curry, but like really like rich and thick, and she would put like a lot of spice into it, like a lot of heat, like chilies and stuff like that. So like if someone who is like Italian American like ate my mom's spaghetti bolognese, like they probably would not think it was authentic. But this is the interesting thing. I feel like when you're in like when you grow up in a household where like um you know your mom grew up cooking one way and your dad another way, both eating very different things, and then you throw in American influences. Like when I was growing up, you know, I wanted to have steak, right? I wanted to have like spaghetti, wanted to have things that made me feel more American. You get these like really interesting renditions of dishes that are kind of like the result of uh, not it's not fusion because that would be like not really representing truly what this is. It's kind of like the emergence of something new, right? And I'm trying to think of like another good example, like something that my mom made that was like emblematic of what happens when you get like multiple different cultures melting into one household thrown on top of that living in America. But I can come back to it. But anyway, like long story short, I ate a lot of Indian food growing up. Um, and one thing here in Shanghai that I really struggle with is like,
Finding good Indian food.
yeah, yeah. It's actually all very commercialized and kind of geared towards like local palates. But I've had some like homemade Indian food here, and that's brought me a little bit closer back to home. But like that's the thing, like every Indian like mom or every Indian auntie like has their own recipe for things,
Yeah.
and it's just like it's weird. It's like you can't like you can't ever get exactly the way you had it at home.
Yeah,
like
I
no matter
think
what.
it's like the same for Asian
Yeah.
cooks. Like they just throw in whatever. It's like remember that fried rice college essay that we read?
Oh yeah, I showed you that.
Yes.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's like that. Like they just do whatever. Yeah, that's my mom. Yeah, and my mom's
What
like a really good cook.
what's like your mom's signature dish?
The thing with my mom is that like she's she can do like Western food really well, and she can also do Chinese food and like Asian food. She can cook like basically everything and bake almost everything. But I can't really pinpoint what her signature dish is because she can make like everything, and our our meals change every day, which I feel very blessed about that.
Yeah. And like
Yeah.
it's like your mom cooking, not like your IE.
Yeah.
That's yeah. There was something I remember like every time I go home to visit my family from China, like I know I'm home when like I'll well, it depends on what time I get home. But like if I get home late at night, usually my mom has cooked something
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
earlier in the evening and has like stored it, and then I'll heat it up.
Yeah.
And so that's one familiar sense is like the smell of that like whatever she's cooked that's reheated. Usually it's some sort of Indian food.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's like if I get home earlier in the day, I'll I'm a little bit jet lagged, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I'll
Sleep.
yeah, I'll put my suitcase away. I'll
Mm-hmm.
go up and I'll take a shower just to like wash off like 20 hours of flying.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll take a nap and I'll wake up and then I just smell um I smell what I think to me like represents home, which is usually like the aroma of like ginger and garlic like
Mm-hmm.
frying and then some sort of like maybe like curry leaves or like coriander like aromatics like that
Mm-hmm.
to what my friends when I was growing up made my house smell like curry.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like to me, to people who would come to my house, they'd be like, "Oh, this smells like a immigrant house." You know, like it's got a weird smell to it. But to me, that smell represents home.
Yeah,
And
like same for me because like
yeah,
my house always smells like food. And when you get off the elevator, like in the apartment building, before you even walk in the door, you can already smell like food or whatever she baked or made that day.
hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, food's interesting. I think it's a besides language, it's probably the second most
Yeah.
significant gateway into like identity,
Mm-hmm.
and is oftentimes um, it's also like an area that increasingly has become a little bit controversial because there's this whole idea of like cultural appropriation related to food.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that? So have you heard about this? Like,
Cultural appropriation food?
yeah. So like, like it would be sort of like, I don't know, like Western chefs that like like open like a Chinese restaurant and have
Mm-hmm.
an interpretation. Or it's like someone putting like kimchi on a pizza, right? And there's like, which I think is delicious. But
Mm-hmm.
there's some people that have sort of um, critiqued the emergence of fusion as kind of I don't know. It's an interesting debate, but I don't know if you've read much about it.
I saw a video like a few weeks ago about a Mexican family going to Korean barbecue
Hmm.
and bringing like tortillas and putting the meat in the tortilla.
I love that.
Okay, I was like, you know what? Do what you want, like as long as you're happy. But like, um, sometimes you need to enjoy things the way they are. Like,
The way they're intended to be
yeah,
enjoyed.
like Korean cuisine stuff, like the real stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me make a counter argument to that. Um, I personally think um, this is like I'd rather that people experience like other people's cultures,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
even if they want to add a little bit of their own to
Yeah,
it,
yeah,
than be like super like closed minded about trying something new.
yeah.
And I think what's interesting is that it seems like every culture has like some sort of barbecue,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like every culture has like some sort of like um, I don't know, like some sort of like soup that you can find similarities like across all these things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really cool when people say bring something from their own culture and say, "Hey, I'm going to like take something from my own culture and kind of mix it with something from another culture." And I think so. I went to college in LA, right? And that was where like the Koji food truck started,
Mm-hmm.
and that was the first Korean barbecue taco.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like a Korean chef, Roy Choi, who created like a Korean barbecue taco. So it was
That's
basically like
cool.
a taco with like bulgogi and like kimchi, and it was like one of the best things I ever had.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember eating that for the first time and thinking like, man, when like cultures that like use tons of spices and make really good food decide
Mm-hmm.
to like mix elements of their cuisines together, like awesome things happen.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I feel like I get what you mean. And I think it can be annoying sometimes when you see like a white person like talk about like how one should like eat like a curry.
Did,
Like,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Did you see the controversy recently about James Corden?
What did he do?
Do you know
He's a
who he
chef,
is?
right? No,
No.
a comedian.
No, he's like a talk show host.
Yeah. Oh, the British one, right?
Yeah.
Sorry,
The fat
I was thinking
British
of like
guy.
Cordon
Gordon
Bleu
Ramsay.
or something like that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway. So James Corden.
Yes, I know who he hosts like the late night
Yeah,
show,
yeah.
right?
So
Yeah.
he had a controversy recently because he has a show called "Spill Your Guts" or like "Eat Something." I forgot what it's called, but like there's like a platter of disgusting foods,
Uh-huh.
quote unquote disgusting foods, and
What he means, but so what that ended up being was like ethnic foods.
yeah, like Asian foods. And then
Yeah.
recently, like people discover like those are like Asian foods, like there's like 1,000-year-old egg on it.
Pidan.
Yeah, and yeah, like obviously to a white person that's gonna sound disgusting, but like it's like a really common food in China, right?
Yeah.
And then so foods like that are on the platter, and then he invites celebrities, and they either have to tell a secret, or they eat one of the disgusting foods, and then so yeah, like
Well,
all those, but no, like maybe like American people don't know what those foods are, but like if those Asian people were watching that, isn't it kind of like hurtful how their regular foods are being like shamed like that?
yeah, that's kind of whack.
Yeah.
So this guy's from the UK, right?
Yeah.
You know what's even more disgusting?
What?
How terrible British food is. Like, have you ever had like
No.
haggis pie or whatever it is,
Is
or
it
haggis?
that bad?
It's disgusting. I mean, he should have started with his own. He should have started with his own cuisine first.
Yeah.
Like, if you've ever had to eat like, I mean, okay, I'll give the British one thing: they do a pretty good breakfast, but that's about it. That's about it.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Wait, what were
But-
we just talking about?
Like the whole debate about the appropriation of
Oh,
like
yeah, yeah.
foods and cuisines. So I think like that's an egregious example. I think that is definitely like out of bounds. But I think there's a difference between, and I mean this is something that people bring up in the whole entire like appropriation versus appreciation debate. I think if something emerges organically, I think it should be celebrated. Like if you think about it, like think about how many dishes exist in China that like are the result of like cultures that have moved through the region,
Yeah.
right? Like curry's a good example too, right? Like I'm pretty sure curry originated in the Indian subcontinent.
Yeah, but there's like Japanese curry.
Yeah, Vietnamese curry, Japanese curry, and it's because there was like traders and people that brought like their ingredients and their like cooking methodologies to different places. And I think I don't want to be the type of person that says like just because this one dish has its like ultimate roots in this one place doesn't mean that like you can't claim your own version of it.
Yeah.
Because like coming back to identity, I feel like in a weird way, if I had that mindset, then I would be saying like I couldn't claim my Croatian identity or my Indian identity because yeah, like my roots are there, but or sorry, I couldn't claim my like American identity, right? But I do kind of identify as American. So I think in the same way that like we as people have been, as a result of a lot of factors, have been dispersed throughout the world and mixed with one another. Food is just like the emergence of like new types of cuisines is just like a natural byproduct of that.
Yeah.
And sometimes when you see like the extreme examples, like people using like tacos to eat like Korean barbecue, or tortillas rather, that's just like the modern version of that happening right before your eyes. You know what I mean? Like 100 years from now, that might not seem weird.
Yeah.
There's going to be probably like a whole race of like mixed Asian and like Latino kids, right?
Yeah.
Like that are like, yeah, this is my food. This is like what my parents made. They made like Korean barbecue with
In tacos.
That's what they made at home, right? So I think that's
Maybe.
super interesting. Yeah.
So, to conclude, I feel like people still judge others too much based on their struggles with coming to terms with their nationality and where they identify with. And I'm really glad that I personally have come to terms with where I'm from. And I'm really glad that I have Taiwanese and Chinese and I guess American parts in my identity.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that I would kind of wrap this discussion on. First, I do agree with you. I think that people who I think the thing is that no one has there's very few people in the world now who has a very straightforward identity.
Yeah.
Right? Because like we define identity, it's such a broad term, right? It can be related to like our culture. It can be related to like ethnicity, nationality, all kinds of different things come together to contribute to our identity. And I think people do need to give one another space to like explore that and recognize that like there are some very real challenges that people have when coming to sort of terms with who they are, right, and their place in the world and their personal and family history, right? It's very complicated for some people. So on the one hand, I agree with you, and I think that people should be like more understanding of that and more sensitive to it. On the other hand, I think that like when I look back at my own personal story, I think that was kind of like once I learned, and I mentioned this earlier, but like the advice that I would give like anyone who is like younger and is kind of going through and grappling with their identity is to have a bit of fun with it, right? Like we take these issues very seriously, like, and we should, but I think if you take them too seriously and like you're too critical about them, you can ultimately end up just like making your own journey worse off and like less pleasant. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier, but I think it was like when I learned to just like embrace kind of maybe the jokes or even embrace some of like the microaggressions, and like that was my way of almost like not only disarming the people that might have been like subconsciously like sort of making statements that were hurtful or ignorant, but also allowed me, kind of gave me like the agency to accept who I was, right? And realize that like focus on like the strengths that like my dynamic identity brings me and the advantages that it brings me. And just a really quick story to wrap it up from my end. I remember I was in India when Croatia was in the 2018 World Cup. And I was actually at a bar with my friend watching the quarterfinal match between Croatia and Russia. And I was wearing a Croatian jersey. And like all these Indian people came up to me and they were asking me like, oh, are you from Croatia? And I said, well, sort of. Like my mother's from Croatia, but my father's actually from right here in Mumbai.
Yeah.
And the really cool thing about that was like all of them were super fascinated by this and were asking me like all of these questions. And I realized like instead of being like annoyed by this, like this is a real cool opportunity to share like who I am and my unique story and to take pride in like both sides of my identity. What I found is that like when you like engage people at that level, they tend to be really like responsive and just interested. And I think that like that was one of the moments like when Croatia won that game and I watched it in India where I like finally felt like sort of like comfortable with strongly claiming like both those sides. Yeah, both sides, because it also helped that like the people that I was around were like kind of supportive of that too. Didn't call me like a fake Croatian fan or a fake Indian. They just were really interested. And I think oftentimes like a lot of these sort of moments where people might feel like they're being like slighted because of like some aspect of their identity, you know, like I was bringing up earlier when like someone called me like an all-American kid or somebody makes fun of your name or what happened to you in Sanya. Honestly, like if you just are willing to kind of like engage with those people in like a conversation about it and not just get upset about it and sulk and be like, people will never understand. I think it is a lot about just like education and like engaging with people about it, and then sometimes having fun, being a bit self-deprecating. So
I think ultimately we should all just embrace, I guess, where we're from and be
Yeah.
proud of it. And especially like those kids who don't want to admit where they're from. I feel like in the future we all like regret not being proud of it originally. So I think that's what we can take away from this conversation.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Like my main takeaway would be, like, it is really important to explore one's own identity with like nuance and like a critical eye, and have conversations, you know, with your parents about it and whatnot, and like look through your family history. But like as you get older, I think you just naturally gain like a little bit of like a wider perspective and a greater appreciation for how your unique identity has turned you into the person that you've become. And it becomes like, I think when I was younger, it felt a bit like a burden. And now that I've become older and I've hit that wise age of 30, where I have all this wisdom now, overnight, I have come to appreciate what it's provided me, not what it may have taken away from me.
Yeah. Okay.
Awesome.
Cool.
Great. Thank you. This was a lot of fun, Mamie.
Yeah, thanks for being on my podcast. My first episode.
Well, not your first episode, but your first episode with the name Bigmouth.
Yeah.
Cool. All right.
Look forward to more interesting episodes like this one.
Awesome.
Nice.
Good job. That was interesting.
That was 57 minutes.